I almost lost everything that I'd worked so hard to create. I want this to be a warning to you so you don't make the same mistake and risk losing everything. This was all due to one avoidable mistake. A lot of real estate investors are really nervous about having terrible tenants, getting sued, having some sort of terrible insurance claim. Well, I had all three of those happen to me at the same time. It all started last summer. I got a call from my property manager who manages my 40 or so properties, and he said one of my properties had a leak. The roof was leaking and it needed to be replaced. A big storm had come through and the roof on this property had finally failed. It was old, insurance wasn't going to cover it. It just needed to be replaced. I knew the roof was old when I bought it. I put it off as long as I could. Finally, it was time to replace it to the tune of $6,000. And then a few weeks later, I got another call that I had a water leak in one of the vacant properties that I was rehabbing. The remodel on the bathroom that I had just finished was completely destroyed. The original hardwood floors on the property were buckled, swollen, and couldn't be salvaged. That was the nicest feature of the entire house. They'd probably been there for 50 years. They looked amazing, they were beautiful, and now they were completely ruined. It was going to cost me another $10,000 to do the rehab again. I was hoping insurance was going to take care of it, but more on that in a minute. But then a few days later, I got a call that the AC units went out on 2 different properties. It was in the dog days of summer in the deep south. The temperature was over 100 degrees and the heat index was 110 or higher. These units were old and they finally died at the worst time possible. They had to be replaced. They were $4,000 each. I couldn't believe it. Another $8,000, and I haven't even gotten to the worst part yet. I'm coming to that later. One of the tenants in the house actually had a young baby, and they just simply couldn't stay overnight in a property that was that hot. It was going to be another 2 whole days before the contractor could get to the job. AC units were dying left and right due to the abysmal heat. The contractors were working 15, 16-hour days and still couldn't keep up. And then I found out that my contractor on a big flip had skipped out on a $100,000 rehab project. He just simply left me holding a bag. So now I had another property that was sitting idle with half a rehab project left to do. And if that wasn't enough, I got a certified letter from the IRS and it said, "Final notice." Somehow I hadn't paid my payroll taxes for the previous year. I mailed in the check, but for some reason it wasn't processed. To make matters even worse, my attorney sent me an invoice for a frivolous lawsuit that I'd been tied up in. A tenant in one of my properties was suing me over a preposterous claim that had zero bearing in reality. But in the US, you can be sued for any reason and you have to pay an attorney to defend you. Over the course of this case, I had accrued $18,000 in legal fees, and now it had come due. I was thinking that my expenses would be something like $2,000, $3,000, maybe on the high end $5,000. I could not have been more wrong. My cash reserves were being depleted fast. A few months prior, I'd put a big land project in Texas under contract to the tune of a $70,000 deposit. I pulled that deposit from my repair reserves, thinking that this would be a really good opportunity and it was worth the risk, which I had pulled from my emergency fund to secure this opportunity that had a huge upside potential. So I'd shelled out a lot of capital to capture some big opportunities and pay for a string of bad luck. And before I knew it, I was seriously low on cash. And my wife and I were setting up 3 Airbnbs. We were spending between $10,000 and $15,000 per unit to furnish these properties. So we were paying for everything on top of that. So remember that water leak that I mentioned before? My insurance claim was denied. My policy doesn't cover that type of leak. There's a clause in the policy that, of course, I hadn't read that excluded them from covering that expense. So I had to pay for the rehab on that property twice. I had to tear up the damaged floor and replace everything again. But it gets even worse. I received an invoice from my property manager on the rehab of several of the properties I had that had been damaged by tenants. The total bill for the repair was $72,000. I was thinking it was going to be $10,000, $20,000, maybe $30,000 on the high end. The work had been done, the contractors had been paid, and now the bill was due. My cash reserves were simply depleted, and I just didn't have the cash to cover the $72,000 invoice. For the first time in my career as an investor, I was really wondering how I was going to come up with the cash to pay for all these unplanned expenses. I had $250,000 of cash seemingly evaporate in just a few months. At this point, I was trying to make sure that checks weren't bouncing. Oh, and property taxes were coming due in the next month. Taxes were due on all 40 of my properties, and my cash reserves had just simply been wiped out. What in the world had gone wrong? How had it come unwound so quickly? So now you may be wondering, how did you survive this? And there were a lot of really sleepless nights. I had a lot of trouble keeping my head on square, but I had to admit to myself that it was all my fault. I had to take 100% ownership. I kind of had to tell myself, bro, you got yourself into this. Now it's up to you to get yourself out. So I looked at my financial situation, and luckily I had assets. I had other properties that had equity in them. The problem with equity in a property is you can't easily tap into it. You either have to sell the property and cash out basically, or you have to do a refinance to pull the equity out of those properties, which typically is not a fast transaction. So that's what I did, is I applied for loans to pull cash out of my existing properties. But of course, this was the time that the Fed started raising rates. The cost of borrowing money was getting more and more expensive. Plus, I had the IRS breathing down my neck. My flips weren't selling, my land deal was in jeopardy, and I was spending all of my time getting these Airbnbs stood up. I was having a terrible time getting hold of the IRS. You'd be surprised how hard it is to get somebody from the IRS on the phone who can actually help you. It turns out just one guy was able to work on my file, and he was impossible to get a hold of. I didn't even have his name. Finally, my accountant was able to work through some back channels and get this guy's cell phone number, and we're able to get on this call together and figure out how to solve it. Finally, we got that sorted out after months of trying to get a hold of the right person at the IRS. And then I was able to apply for these loans, pay the expedite fee, and finally get some breath of fresh air, some cash coming into my account so I could at least breathe. I wasn't anywhere near where I wanted to be, but I could at least pay some of these bills. I was also able to cancel my land deal down in Texas and get all of my 70 grand of deposit back one day before it became non-refundable. So what was my big mistake? How had I overextended myself so much that I was vulnerable to lady luck nearly knocking me out? It's a lesson I assure you that I will never forget. It basically boiled down to 3 components. Number 1 is I was being driven by ego way more than I would care to admit. I had rentals, I had flips, I had Airbnbs, I had a land deal. Oh, look at me. This is your ego talking, and I was guilty of playing into that. It gave me a sense of significance that I was becoming something in life. The second thing was that I was spreading myself out way too thin. I had too many things going, I had too many plates I was trying to spin, and I was losing track of the details, and I was missing really important things that could have indicated to me that there were problems coming, that I shouldn't be extending myself too much. I was getting out over my skis because I was basically distracted with my own projects. And the last component is that I abdicated responsibility instead of paying attention to the details and knowing my numbers. Basically, I was getting sloppy and I was relying on other people to do things without me checking in to know if things were done. There's no way I should have been able to write a $12,000 check and not know that it hadn't been cashed. I should have been visiting my flip projects much more often and keeping a much closer eye on the contractors. I had just abdicated and let them take care of it. I wasn't paying attention. My business decision process was completely flawed. I just simply didn't know how much money was allocated for what. And it almost took me out. I simply didn't have 70 grand available to deploy for a land deal, no matter how big the potential upside could have been. That cash was reserved to pay taxes and cover repairs, but it was all lumped into one big pile, so I didn't know because I didn't know my numbers. I probably didn't have the cash to be deploying into new Airbnbs. I was just out over my skis. I was doing too much. But when you see 250 grand plus in your bank account and an opportunity presents itself where you could put in maybe $10,000, $15,000 and get a 30% return on your money, it's very tempting. The big mistake that nearly wiped me out was making investment decisions based on my bank balance alone. So the lesson to learn from this is no matter what type of business you're in, is to run your business like a business. Know your numbers. Hire a professional bookkeeper because you're probably not doing it well, if at all. Run monthly reports and then have a weekly meeting Even if you're a solopreneur, have a weekly meeting with your bookkeeper to go over your data so that you know where your money is. So that when an opportunity does present itself, you can look at your budgetary numbers and say, oh, we have some money set aside for new opportunities. This money that's sitting over here is for taxes and repairs, and we don't touch that. Instead of giving in to the temptation to making a quick decision based on your bank balance. If you ever log into your bank balance and look at your balance and make a decision based on that, you're making the mistake that I made. You could risk investing into a hole that you may not be able to climb up out of. I was incredibly lucky that I was able to find a way out. I've actually made another video right here that you can look at on how to build a business from scratch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.